All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack the complex, often totally misunderstood realities of global migration. We're going to be looking closely at some brand new reporting and hard data from the first 4 months of 2026. Now, migration is a topic that absolutely dominates our daily headlines, right? But the real story on the ground and the actual legal definitions of who is moving and why, they almost always get lost in the noise. The sheer scale of the misconceptions we're dealing with right now is literally reshaping political landscapes and human lives. So today, we're going to fix that. Here is our roadmap for today. First up, the migration paradox, followed by a look at the most dangerous routes and the human toll behind them. Then, we'll break down why words matter by defining migration, contrast smuggling versus trafficking, and finally, look at the big picture. Section 1. The migration paradox. We're starting off with a staggering data contradiction.
So, here's a massive puzzle we have to solve when looking at the International Organization for Migration, or IOM, data from early 2026. If fewer people are actually arriving at their destinations, why on earth are these journeys getting so much more deadly? When you dig into the numbers, there's a sharp fall in the raw number of people successfully arriving in places like Europe. But at the exact same time, there is a massive, incredibly concerning spike in the lethality of those very same journeys.
Ugochi Daniels, the Deputy Director General at the IOM, really hit the nail on the head here when she said, fewer arrivals do not mean safer journeys. It is absolutely crucial to remember that behind every single one of these statistics is a human family waiting for a phone call that never comes. As border enforcement tightens in the usual areas, people are being pushed into far more perilous, unmonitored territories where rescue operations are practically non-existent, which makes the journeys significantly longer and more dangerous.
To put this paradox into perspective, just think about the central Mediterranean route. Irregular arrivals absolutely plummeted, dropping 46%, down to 8,577 people. But get this, in that exact same window, fatalities and missing persons more than doubled. We're talking an increase of 111%, totaling 821 lives lost. Why the sudden danger? Well, reports point to a really lethal mix. Smugglers are using increasingly makeshift, unseaworthy vessels to evade detection, and when you combine that with shifting, unpredictable weather patterns, these already risky crossings turn into absolute fatal traps.
Moving on to Section 2, tracking the dangerous routes and how global movements are constantly shifting.
These shifts are happening all over the map, and they're highly lethal. In the eastern Mediterranean, fatalities skyrocketed by an astonishing 259%, largely driven by catastrophic sea disasters near Crete. Meanwhile, over on the West African coast, departure points are shifting much further south. Smugglers are basically launching from more distant shores just to bypass patrols, which drastically lengthens the sea crossing to Spain and ramps up the risks of starvation, dehydration, and capsizing. On the flip side, northbound movement through Panama's notoriously brutal Darien region has practically stopped cold. Only 135 transits were recorded. That's almost entirely due to sudden, strict shifts in regional border policies.
But it's kind of like a water balloon. When you squeeze one side, it just bulges somewhere else. Not all numbers dropped. Take the western Mediterranean route to Spain, for instance. Arrivals there actually jumped 66% to 5,647. This was driven largely by a threefold increase in really desperate land crossings to the enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. It just proves an undeniable reality about global mobility. When one route closes or becomes way too treacherous, the human drive to find safety doesn't just disappear. The flow just redirects, and another route surges.
Section 3. The human toll. Keeping focus on the lives behind all these numbers.
It really is like a domino effect when you look at how localized events create these massive ripple effects. Just look at the first 4 months of 2026. In January, Cyclone Harry struck, devastating communities and leading to 430 deaths on the central Mediterranean route as people fled the immediate aftermath. Then, late February hits, and escalating hostilities in the Middle East create this immense, sudden pressure and large-scale displacement in Lebanon. That instability directly drove a wave of cross-border returns to Syria through March and April. In just a tiny 4-month window, sudden shocks from both Mother Nature and human conflict combined to force massive shifts in mobility.
So, having tracked where these dangerous journeys are happening and the data driving them, we really need to answer the most important question. Who are the people actually making these journeys? When we see these daily headlines, how do we know exactly who they're talking about? For that, we turn to the UNHCR Journalism Guide.
Section 4. Words matter. Let's properly define migration.
Let's start with a major legal distinction that gets messed up all the time. A migrant is someone who moves voluntarily to settle in another country, usually for a job, school, or to be with family. The UNHCR explicitly says we should not use migrant as a blanket term for everyone on the move. When the media labels people fleeing a war zone as migrants, they're literally stripping away the legal context of their flight. On the flip side, an internally displaced person, or IDP, is forced to flee violence or disasters. But the key thing here, they remain inside their own country. They never cross an international border, meaning they are still under the legal protection, or sometimes the danger, of their own government.
Then we have the critical legal threshold between an asylum seeker and a refugee. Basically, an asylum seeker has fled their home country looking for protection and is waiting for a host country to legally recognize their status. A refugee, however, is someone who has been officially recognized under international law, specifically the 1951 Refugee Convention. To get that official refugee status, they have to prove their fear of persecution is linked to specific grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So the big takeaway here is every refugee starts as an asylum seeker, but not every asylum seeker will ultimately be recognized as a refugee.
Section 5. Smuggling versus trafficking. The difference between consent and exploitation. These two terms are constantly tangled in the headlines, but the crucial dividing line is consent and purpose. Human smuggling is basically a transactional service, and happens with the consent of the person. They pay someone to illegally transport them across a border, and once they cross, the transaction is over. Human trafficking, that is a whole different, horrifying reality. It rarely involves consent, and even if it does initially, that consent is rendered totally meaningless by coercion or deception. Trafficking is all about fraud and force, with the specific goal of holding someone captive for ongoing economic exploitation, sexual exploitation, or forced labor. Mixing these two terms up changes a story from a border crossing issue to a severe human rights violation.
Section 6. The big picture. Let's zoom out and understand the actual scale of all this.
Let's step back and look at the whole shebang. Right now, there are 304 million international migrants globally. That is a huge number. But here is the reality check. While the evening news fixates heavily on a few specific, highly dangerous routes into Europe or North America, the broader data tells a totally different story. Nearly half of all those international migrants actually just remain within their own immediate regions. People in Africa overwhelmingly migrate to other African nations. People in Asia largely move within Asia. They're just moving for work, family, or immediate safety. The media attention is disproportionately hyper-focused on a very small fraction of the total global movement.
Ultimately, it's so important to remember that these massive, abstract statistics represent real, highly vulnerable individuals. We are talking about separated children and unaccompanied minors navigating this completely alone without a legal guardian. It really brings home why these legal definitions, refugee versus economic migrant or trafficked victim versus smuggled individual, aren't just semantics. They are desperately necessary to make sure these people get the specific protections they are legally owed.
So armed with the actual 2026 data and the correct legal terminology, how are you going to decode the next headline you see about a migration crisis? Will you pause and ask if they're talking about an asylum seeker or an economic migrant? Will you check if a route is experiencing that deadly paradox we talked about? Understanding the facts is the absolute first step to true media literacy. Hopefully this explainer has given you the clear picture you need to make sense of a deeply complex world.